HOA violation notice. The email arrived like a cold, official decree, stripping away years of peace. It wasn't just a notice. It was an invasion, an ultimatum that threatened to unravel the very fabric of my home, my sanctuary. One signature, one petty rule, and suddenly, the life I'd carefully built was under siege by a force far more insidious than any outside intruder. This wasn't a fight I chose, but it became one I absolutely had to win. What happens when the people sworn to uphold community order become its greatest threat? The house stood on a coveted corner lot, not ostentatious, but meticulously cared for. For Elias, it was more than just structure and siding. It was the final, satisfying chapter after years of relentless work and sacrifice. The manicured lawn, the deep, two-car driveway, the towering oak that cast perfect shade over the front porch, each detail represented a promise kept to himself. This was his sanctuary in the suburban expanse of Willow Creek, a neighborhood that promised tranquility and community. Willow Creek wasn't defined by its gates, but by its expectations. There was an unspoken agreement among the homeowners. Maintain the illusion of seamless perfection. For years, Elias had happily complied. His contributions to the annual cleanup were legendary, and his holiday lights were tasteful, never excessive. Life there had settled into a comfortable rhythm of quiet weekends, evening walks, and the predictable hum of lawnmowers on Saturday mornings. But beneath the surface of manicured perfection, a latent energy existed, the Homeowners Association. The HOA was embodied by the perpetually smiling, yet intensely watchful, figure of Beverly, a longtime resident who chaired the Architectural Review Committee. She lived for the rulebook, and where the rulebook was vague, she lived for interpretation. The first seed of tension wasn't a fine or a formal notice, but a subtle shift in routine. Elias began noticing Beverly's long, slow drives past his house, her head turned slightly, her gaze lingering just a moment too long on the deepest part of his driveway, the one spot where a non-compliant vehicle seemed to rest just a hair too close to the property line. It was a silent observation, a look that conveyed disapproval and power, an unwritten warning that his perfect life in Willow Creek was about to be measured against a very precise and very petty yardstick. The quiet tension was starting to build, signaling that the suburban dream was far more fragile than he had ever imagined. The initial slow drives by Beverly soon transformed into something more sinister. Official communication. Elias first found the slender, cream-colored envelope tucked into his screen door, the paper crisp with officialdom, the address typed in an impersonal, precise font. It was a covenant violation notice. The infraction, vehicle placement, the rule, buried deep within the association's 140-page binder of regulations, stated that vehicles could not, under any circumstances, impede the clear, unobstructed use of the common sidewalk or neighbor's access point. Elias's old but faithful pickup truck, primarily used for his weekend carpentry projects, rested on the far right edge of his driveway, its nose just a few inches closer to the sidewalk than Beverly preferred. It was an absurdity, a microscopic measurement weaponized for control. The first notice came with a polite request to remedy the situation within 7 days. Elias, wanting peace, simply adjusted the truck, meticulously parking it a full foot back, well within his property and far from the sidewalk. He took a dated photograph and submitted it, believing the matter was closed. He was wrong. 2 days later, a second notice arrived. This time, the violation was improper long-term parking, citing the very truck he'd just moved. The language had sharpened, the tone colder, and this one carried the threat of a fine. A $50 penalty was assessed, payable within 10 days, with the warning that continuous violation would result in escalation. The absurdity was escalating, twisting simple, neighborly coexistence into a bureaucratic war. Elias realized this wasn't about parking. It was about power. It was Beverly testing the waters, seeing how much control she could assert before he pushed back. Her slow drives became frequent stops. She began parking her own immaculate sedan directly across the street, sitting for minutes, sometimes 10, watching him leave and return, a silent, unsettling sentry. The tension became a palpable weight in the air, transforming the simple act of coming home into a daily performance under scrutiny. The next fine doubled. Then it quadrupled. The infractions were ludicrously creative: unapproved color of landscape mulch, excessive moss growth on north-facing shingles, and finally, the most infuriating, unauthorized use of common property for storage, which referred to the moments his carpentry tools rested on the driveway edge while he loaded them. Elias sought the advice of a neighbor, Mr. Henderson, a retired lawyer who lived 2 streets over. Henderson, a man worn down by years of similar, low-grade HOA warfare, simply shrugged, offering a grim piece of advice. You can fight them, but they use your money to fight you. You pay their salary, they fine you to pay their legal bills. It's a closed loop of control. This revelation, that his own HOA dues were funding the harassment, ignited a slow, white-hot fury in Elias. He decided to fight, not with lawyers, but with precision. He meticulously documented every one of Beverly's observation periods, every notice, every rule she cited. He bought a professional-grade laser measuring tape and began checking his property against the rulebook centimeter by agonizing centimeter. He even found a glaring flaw in the HOA's own governing documents. They detailed where a vehicle must be parked, but failed to address what constituted a vehicle. This detail would prove to be the crack in the foundation of Beverly's reign. But before he could execute his carefully constructed counter-strategy, Beverly escalated the conflict beyond mere fines. One Friday afternoon, Elias returned from work to find his driveway physically blocked, not by a car, but by a haphazard, ugly assembly of dilapidated garbage cans and construction debris, positioned perfectly at the transition point between the curb and his asphalt. Attached was a formal letter, stamped with the HOA seal, informing him that until all outstanding fines were paid, the HOA was exercising its right under Article 4, Section B, to restrict access to the property as necessary to protect community interests. This act was personal, petty, and highly illegal. It was no longer a disagreement over mulch color. It was a brazen, daily inconvenience designed to break him. He couldn't even pull his truck into his own garage. He had to park several houses down and walk, a public display of his defeat meant to send a message to the rest of Willow Creek. The HOA wins. Elias felt the shame and the burn of injustice, but instead of calling a lawyer, he spent that night studying his documentation, poring over the fine print, and sketching design plans. The blockage was the final, unforgivable transgression. He was no longer just a homeowner protecting his property. He was a strategist preparing an audacious, permanent defense. The absurdity of Beverly's escalating control had just handed him the perfect opening. She had played the card of physical obstruction, and Elias was about to respond with brute, unmovable permanence. The simple, innocent item she had accused him of violating, the parking of a vehicle, was about to be transformed into a weapon she would never see coming, a silent, 4-ton middle finger to the entire HOA establishment. The confrontation wasn't announced with a formal meeting or a carefully typed letter. It arrived with the grinding sound of heavy machinery. Elias had spent 3 sleepless weeks preparing. The 4-ton planters, which he now privately called the monoliths of spite, were meticulously engineered. They were not flimsy terracotta, but massive, reinforced concrete cubes, built off-site and designed to be functionally permanent. Each one was precisely dimensioned to the millimeter, not to exceed the height restrictions for permanent landscape installations, and crucially, they were classified as landscaping by the city code, bypassing the HOA's stringent vehicle and accessory structures regulations. He had found the loophole. The HOA's document mentioned nothing about movable landscaping elements, and these were technically movable if you brought a specialized forklift. The morning the delivery truck arrived, carrying the first of the 3 behemoths, was the day Beverly decided to stake her claim personally. She emerged from her house like a general surveying a besieged fortress, phone pressed to her ear, her voice a strained, high-pitched squawk. The sight of the massive flatbed truck and the hydraulic lift dropping its support beams onto the asphalt galvanized her into frenzied action. The first monolith, a dull gray concrete block, was slowly maneuvered into position. It was placed exactly, definitively, and permanently on the line where Beverly had repeatedly claimed Elias was illegally parked. When the final chain was detached, the block stood as an uncompromising statement of ownership. Beverly sprinted across the street, shrieking into her phone about unauthorized construction and demanding an immediate police presence. The construction crew, professionals well acquainted with neighborhood drama, simply ignored her, focusing on the careful placement of the second planter. "You cannot do this. This is a violation. I will have the HOA fine you out of this neighborhood," she screamed, her face a mask of scarlet fury. Elias walked out onto his porch, holding a single, crisp sheet of paper. His calm was the sharpest weapon against her chaos. "Good morning, Beverly," he said, his voice flat. "This is a public service announcement." As the second monolith settled with a deep, earth-shaking thud, Elias held up the document. It was the official city planning permit for the placement of the landscape elements, complete with the stamp of approval. He had skipped the HOA entirely and gone straight to the municipality, exploiting the legal hierarchy. "These are permanent, non-vehicle, landscape features," Elias stated, projecting his voice so the few neighbors who were now peeking through their blinds could hear. "They are perfectly compliant with the City of Willow Creek's code for permanent boundary demarcation. They are on my property. And they are heavy." The third monolith, the final piece of his blockade, was the most dramatic. It was placed parallel to the first two, creating a narrow, perfect boundary that reclaimed his driveway and prevented any vehicle, or trash bin, or petty obstruction from being placed near his access point ever again. It created an unmistakable 4-ton barrier between his right-of-way and the street. Beverly, realizing the police wouldn't help and that her favorite weapon, the fine book, was useless against a city permit, delivered her ultimate blow. She stepped directly in front of the third monolith as the crew tried to position it, turning the conflict physical. "You move these right now, or I will consider this a full-scale assault on the entire community," she spat. The construction foreman sighed, stopped the lift, and looked at Elias. This was the moment of peak tension, the point of no return. Elias walked up to Beverly, not aggressively, but with the quiet, terrifying resolution of a man who had been pushed too far. He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, intense rumble that carried more weight than the concrete structures behind him. "You blocked my driveway every day for weeks. You fined me for mulch. You used my money to harass me," he recounted, each word a hammer blow. "These monoliths are legally defined as landscaping. If you touch them, you are vandalizing my property. If you try to move them, you are wasting the HOA's money on a legal fight you already lost. And if you stand there another second, I will have the police charge you for obstructing a licensed construction crew working on private property." He stepped back and nodded to the foreman. The foreman, seeing the cold conviction in Elias's eyes, gave the order. The hydraulic lift whined, and the third monolith was slowly lowered. Beverly, frozen in her fury, finally realized the gravity of the situation. The monolith descended, missing her by a terrifying few inches, settling with a final, echoing impact. She was defeated. Her petty reign of driveway terror was permanently and literally set in stone. She staggered back, the reality of the unmovable, legally protected, 4-ton solution washing over her. The silence that fell over the street, broken only by the idling truck, was the sound of a power shift. Elias looked at the 3 massive blocks, his ultimate act of noncompliance and compliance. The planters, empty for now, stood as a monument to his victory. The battle was over, but the consequences for Beverly and the future of the HOA were just beginning to unfold. The only question now was how the community would react to the permanent, undeniable testament to the pettiness that had nearly ruined a man's home. The silence that followed the final thud of the third monolith was heavier than the concrete itself. Beverly, defeated and exposed, didn't attempt to challenge the workers further. Her hasty retreat was not a dignified exit but a stumble of shocked realization. She vanished into the security of her perfectly manicured fortress across the street, leaving behind the 3 massive blocks, the monoliths of spite, as the unanswerable physical evidence of her profound failure. The neighbors, having watched the entire confrontation unfold from behind their blinds and curtains, dared to emerge. Their reaction wasn't curiosity. It was a collective sigh of vindication. Elias saw the quick, furtive nods and the fleeting smiles, the silent acknowledgement from people who had also suffered under the weight of Beverly's petty reign but had lacked the will, or the strategy, to fight back. The monoliths were not just landscape features. They were now the physical symbol of resistance finally erected in Willow Creek. The Homeowners Association's response was immediate and predictably aggressive, yet hollow. Within 48 hours, Elias received a letter from the HOA's retained counsel. It was a vicious, multi-page document, demanding the immediate removal of the unauthorized and visually incompatible structures, and threatening a crippling $1,000 daily fine, backed by the commencement of a lawsuit to force compliance. Elias, calm and ready, simply forwarded the attorney's letter, along with his meticulously organized binder of documentation. This was his legal counterstrike, delivered with devastating precision. He included the official city planning department permit, the original HOA rulebook highlighting the crucial loophole regarding landscape element definitions, and a detailed, time-stamped log of every one of Beverly's harassing drive-bys and illegal driveway obstructions. He added a single, chilling-typed sentence. Any attempt to move or alter these legally installed, permitted landscape features will be met with an immediate counterclaim of property damage and documented harassment. The ensuing legal maneuvering was not a war, but a slow, grinding capitulation by the HOA. Their lawyers quickly realized that Elias had done his homework. He hadn't just built 3 blocks of concrete. He had built a legally impenetrable shield around them. The loophole was watertight, and the city permit superseded the HOA's internal rules regarding construction. Furthermore, his documented proof of Beverly's gross abuse of power, using HOA resources to illegally block his personal property access, placed the association in a position of extreme liability, making the lawyers recoil from a potential, costly public lawsuit. The money Elias had reluctantly paid in fines over the previous weeks was returned to him in a sterile cashier's check, an official admission of guilt cloaked in legal formality. The HOA had spent time and resources trying to legally pry loose the 4 tons of concrete, only to realize the actual cost was the loss of their undisputed authority over the community's minor details. The long-term consequences centered entirely on the antagonist, Beverly. Her power had always derived from the perception of being untouchable, the infallible enforcer of the petty laws. Once the monoliths were installed, her position became completely untenable. Every single time she drove past Elias's house, and she couldn't avoid it, she was forced to confront the permanent, brutal failure of her personal overreach. The neighbors, silently emboldened by Elias's victory, began to push back on their own minor infractions, filing their own carefully researched countercomplaints. The climate of fear that Beverly thrived on evaporated, replaced by a widespread, quiet contempt for her failed autocracy. The internal board meetings, once a rubber stamp for Beverly's most aggressive directives, became sessions of heated scrutiny. The HOA membership, suddenly aware of the legal costs incurred by Beverly's personal vendetta, demanded immediate accountability. They realized the true cost of pettiness was being borne by their own community dues. Beverly did not resign gracefully, or even personally. She simply vanished. A short, emotionless, typed letter was distributed signed not by her, but by the HOA secretary, announcing her immediate departure from the board for personal health reasons. The reality was clear. She had been unseated by concrete and code, permanently banished from her position of power by a homeowner who refused to be bullied. Elias's life in Willow Creek fundamentally and permanently changed. He didn't become a neighborhood celebrity, but he became a quiet legend. People kept their distance, not out of fear of his reaction, but out of profound respect for the strategic, unyielding defiance he had shown. He had proven that the true power in an HOA lies not with the loudest, most aggressive voice, but with the homeowner who is willing to meticulously study the fine print. His driveway was now safe, bordered by the magnificent, imposing monoliths, which he eventually filled with drought-resistant, fiery red succulents. A final, beautiful visual statement of vindication rooted in stone. The most profound impact was the psychological shift. The daily anxiety of pulling into his driveway, the fear of the next ridiculous fine, had evaporated entirely. His house felt like a sanctuary again, a home where his right to exist was no longer conditional on the mood of an overzealous board member. The story of the monoliths became the whispered lore of Willow Creek, a permanent, visible reminder that small-scale power taken to extremes inevitably invites an equally extreme and perfectly legal countermeasure. It was a profound lesson in the absurdity of microtyranny, where a 4-ton response was required to settle a 4-inch parking dispute. Elias had learned that in the game of petty neighborhood politics, sometimes the only way to win back your peace is to commit to a solution so massive, so permanent, and so perfectly compliant that your antagonist has no choice but to retreat into the shadows of their own inevitable defeat. The concrete monolith stood not as a symbol of bitterness, but as a silent, powerful testament to the cost of crossing the line and the peace found in absolute finality.